A ship was found drifting in the South Pacific, completely empty, but just weeks earlier, 25 people had been on board. No crew, no passengers, all 25 people gone. No bodies, no survivors, no immediate explanation. When the vessel was finally identified, it was the MV Joyita, a ship that had been reported missing weeks earlier. At first glance, the condition of the ship only raised more questions. It was listing to one side, as if it had taken on water. Parts of the structure were damaged, and several windows were broken. But there was one detail that made everything even more unsettling. The Joyita wasn't sinking. It was still able to stay afloat, and that is exactly what turned this case into one of the ocean's most enduring mysteries.
Because as investigators began to examine the vessel more closely, other details started to stand out. Critical equipment was missing. Navigation instruments were gone. The lifeboats were no longer on board. And yet, there was no clear sign of what had happened to the people. No recorded distress call. No conclusive evidence explaining why the ship had been abandoned. Just a vessel drifting in the open ocean, completely empty. And a question that remains to this day. If the Joyita was still able to float, why would 25 people abandon the ship in the middle of the ocean and disappear without a trace?
Serious investigators began examining the MV Joyita more closely. It became clear that the ship had not been abandoned without reason. There were signs that something had happened on board. The ship's radio, for example, was set to the international distress frequency. This indicated that at some point, someone had attempted to call for help. But there was a problem. The communication system was not functioning properly. One of the cables connecting the radio to the antenna was damaged, severely limiting the signal's range. In practice, any distress call would only have been heard over a very short distance, which helps explain why no transmission was ever recorded. In the engine room, other details stood out. One of the engines had been covered with mattresses. It appears that someone had tried to improvise a way to protect it from water entering the vessel. In addition, part of another engine system had been dismantled. Even so, there were still signs that it had been operational.
Investigators also found water inside the ship. The most likely source was a ruptured pipe in the engine's cooling system. This leak would have allowed water to gradually enter the vessel. And although there was an auxiliary pump that could have helped control the flooding, it was not connected to any power source. In other words, a solution was available, but it was not being used. Some of the ship's most important navigation instruments were also missing. Among them were the sextant and the chronometer, both essential for determining position at sea. The lifeboats were no longer on board, suggesting that they had likely been used.
But perhaps the most intriguing detail of all was found on deck. A medical kit had been discovered open. Inside were instruments and bandages. Some of those bandages showed signs of blood. This suggests that someone on board may have been injured and that an attempt was made to provide treatment. However, this detail was never fully explained by the official investigation. Individually, each of these elements could be interpreted as part of an emergency situation at sea. But taken together, they suggest something more. A scenario in which the situation may have spiraled out of control and critical decisions were made under pressure.
To better understand what may have happened to the MV Joyita, it's important to look at the history of the vessel itself. The ship was built in 1931, originally as a luxury yacht. Its first owner was film director Roland West, a well-known figure in Hollywood at the time. The Joyita was designed to be a robust, comfortable, and technologically advanced vessel for its era. Over the years, however, its role changed. During World War II, the ship was acquired by the United States Navy and used as a patrol vessel. After the war, it was sold again and adapted for commercial use, including fishing and cargo transport.
Throughout these transitions, the Joyita underwent several structural modifications. Some improvements were implemented. Others, however, may have compromised parts of the original system. One of the ship's most important characteristics was its buoyancy. Large amounts of cork had been installed inside the hull, helping the vessel remain afloat even in cases of partial flooding. Over time, the Joyita was no longer a luxury yacht. It became a working vessel, less refined, more worn down, but still operational. Among sailors and those familiar with its history, the ship developed a certain reputation. To some, it was simply an aging vessel with inconsistent maintenance. To others, it was considered problematic, a ship frequently involved in incidents over the years. But regardless of those perceptions, there was one detail that stood out. The Joyita was widely considered extremely difficult to sink, and that makes what happened next even harder to explain.
At the helm of the MV Joyita was Captain Thomas Henry Miller, an experienced seaman with years spent working at sea. But at that point in his life, Miller was facing difficulties. After World War II, he had never fully regained stability. He was in debt and saw that voyage as an opportunity for a fresh start. For him, this was not just another trip. It was a chance to rebuild his financial life and perhaps regain a sense of purpose. He needed that journey to succeed.
On board the ship were 24 other people. In total, there were 16 crew members and 9 passengers. Among the crew were men with varying levels of experience. Some had worked with the captain before, others had not. Among the passengers were individuals who made that journey even more significant. A doctor was traveling to the islands to perform a surgical procedure. There were also people connected to local logistics, responsible for supporting the region's communities.
And among the passengers, there was a family with children. This was not just an ordinary voyage. It was a crossing with real responsibilities. People who depended on that route. People who trusted that vessel. Each of them boarded the Joyita, believing that within a few days, they would safely reach their destination. But that never happened.
The MV Joyita departed from the port of Apia in Samoa in early October 1955. Its destination was the Tokelau Islands, a relatively short journey, expected to take between 41 and 48 hours. But from the very beginning, there were signs that this voyage would not be simple. The departure was delayed, and shortly after leaving the harbor, one of the engines failed. Before even fully setting out, the crew had to deal with the issue. It forced a decision: move forward or turn back.
Captain Miller chose to continue. The Joyita would proceed with only one engine functioning. It was a risky decision. The ship was no longer in perfect condition. It had gone through multiple modifications over the years. It showed clear signs of wear, and now it was operating at reduced capacity. In addition, the vessel was carrying a full load. There was cargo on board, there were passengers, and space was limited.
All of this contributed to an atmosphere of tension from the very start of the journey. Even so, the decision stood. For the captain, turning back meant losing an important opportunity. Moving forward was a gamble, an attempt to make that voyage succeed, despite the risks. And so, the Joyita left the harbor, heading towards its destination. But after that, no one on board was ever seen again.
The MV Joyita was expected to reach its destination just a few days after departure, but it never did. At first, the delay did not raise immediate concern. Considering the ship was operating with only one engine, it was possible the journey was simply taking longer than expected. But as the days passed, the silence became harder to ignore. No communication was received, no distress signal was recorded, and no vessel in the area reported seeing the Joyita.
That's when authorities decided to launch a search operation. The Royal New Zealand Air Force was mobilized. Aircraft surveyed a vast area of the Pacific, searching for any sign of the ship. Other vessels also joined the effort. A large stretch of ocean was examined, but there was nothing. No debris, no lifeboats, no bodies. No clear evidence of what had happened.
After days without results, the search was called off. The Joyita was officially declared missing, and with it, the 25 people on board. For weeks, there were no answers, no clues, no explanation, until in November 1955, the ship was finally found, drifting, partially listing, still afloat, but completely empty.
At first glance, The condition of the MV Joyita suggested that the ship had faced serious problems. There were signs of flooding, systems had been compromised, equipment was no longer functioning properly. But there was one detail that completely changed the analysis. The Joyita was not an ordinary vessel. Because of its structure and the modifications made over the years, it was considered extremely difficult to sink.
Large amounts of cork inside the hull helped keep the ship afloat, even under adverse conditions. In addition, there were empty oil drums on board, which also contributed to its buoyancy. Even with water entering the vessel, even with mechanical failures, the Joyita should have been able to remain afloat for a long time. And this is not just an assumption. The ship was found weeks later, still drifting, still afloat. This is where the central contradiction of the case emerges. If the ship wasn't sinking, if it still offered shelter, supplies, and a degree of safety, why abandon it? At sea, abandoning a vessel is usually a last resort, especially when the ship is still capable of staying afloat. Leaving for the open ocean in smaller lifeboats is an extremely dangerous decision, and in that context, potentially fatal. And yet, everything suggests that is exactly what happened. The lifeboats were gone, the navigation instruments had been taken, and no one remained on board. A ship that should not have sunk was abandoned, and the people who made that decision disappeared without a trace.
Based on the evidence found on the MV Joyita, some explanations have been considered more plausible than others. The first involves a mechanical failure, combined with how the situation may have been perceived on board. A ruptured pipe in the cooling system allowed water to gradually enter the vessel. With the main pump compromised and the auxiliary pump not connected, controlling the flooding became increasingly difficult. For those on board, especially at night, the situation may have appeared far more severe than it actually was. The ship could have seemed unstable, listing, close to sinking.
At the same time, the communication system was compromised. Even if someone attempted to call for help, the radio's range was extremely limited. In practical terms, they were isolated, with no way of knowing whether any distress signal would be received. Another relevant hypothesis involves the possibility that the captain was incapacitated. The blood-stained bandages found on board suggest that someone may have been injured. If that injury involved the captain, it could have directly affected decision-making.
Without clear leadership, the situation may have deteriorated quickly, which leads to a third possibility, a premature abandonment. Faced with a combination of factors, water entering the vessel, system failures, limited communication, and possibly no clear command, the crew may have believed the ship would not survive and chose to abandon it. If that happened, they likely took the lifeboats, navigation instruments, and other essential supplies. But there is a problem. The Joyita would likely have remained afloat. Meanwhile, in the open ocean, aboard much smaller vessels, their chances of survival would have been significantly lower. These theories do not explain every detail, but among the possibilities proposed over the years, they are the ones that best align with the available evidence.
In addition to the more plausible explanations, other theories have also been suggested over the years. Some involve the possibility of external intervention. One of them points to a potential pirate attack. In this scenario, crew members and passengers would have been forcibly removed from the vessel. But this hypothesis has limitations. The Joyita's cargo consisted mainly of basic supplies, items unlikely to attract the attention of pirates. In addition, no clear signs of struggle were found on board.
Another possibility that has been mentioned involves interception by an external force. During the 1950s, the world was in the midst of the Cold War, which led to speculation about the presence of military vessels in the region. However, there are no reliable records to support this hypothesis. The idea of an insurance fraud scheme has also been raised. According to this theory, the disappearance may have been planned for financial gain.
But investigations found no evidence pointing in that direction. On the contrary, the available information suggests real mechanical issues with the vessel, not a deliberate act. These theories expand the range of possibilities, but overall,
they tend to be less consistent when compared to explanations grounded in the physical evidence found on the ship. Over the years, the case of the MV Joyita has also become associated with more speculative interpretations, ideas that do not arise from direct evidence, but from the unusual nature of the case itself. The complete disappearance of everyone on board, without any trace, created space for this kind of interpretation. One of the most well-known involves the ship's own reputation. Throughout its history, the Joyita had been involved in multiple incidents, groundings, mechanical issues, frequent modifications. For some, this was simply the result of an aging vessel with ongoing maintenance problems. For others, this pattern of events was interpreted differently. The idea that the Joyita was somehow unlucky. In some cases, this perception evolved even further into the notion of a possible curse associated with the ship. Other theories go even beyond that. Some suggest the possibility of unexplained phenomena at sea, events that cannot be easily understood within conventional explanations.
There are also those who connect the case to broader patterns of mysterious disappearances, often associated with ocean regions, known for unusual reports. These interpretations are part of the popular imagination. They represent attempts to make sense of an event that remains without a definitive explanation. But from an investigative standpoint, there is no concrete evidence to support these possibilities.
Even after formal investigations, the case of the MV Joyita never received a definitive explanation. Some points, however, were established with clarity. The condition of the ship indicated that water had entered the vessel, systems were compromised, and there were clear signs that something had happened on board before it was abandoned. The official conclusion points to a ruptured pipe in the engine's cooling system as the origin of the problem. From that point, water would have gradually entered the vessel. With the main pump compromised and the auxiliary pump not connected, the situation may have worsened over time. This helps explain how the problem began, but it does not explain what happened next.
The most plausible explanations suggest a combination of factors: mechanical failure, limited communication, a possible injury on board, psychological pressure, elements that, together, may have led to decisions made under uncertainty. Even so, key questions remain unanswered. If the ship was still able to float, why was it abandoned? And after that, what happened to everyone on board? No clear trace was ever found. No definitive answer ever emerged. These questions remain open, and they are what keep the Joyita case relevant to this day.
The MV Joyita was found, drifting, damaged, but still afloat. A ship that, in theory, should never have been abandoned. But the 25 people on board disappeared. No bodies were ever found. No survivors ever emerged. And no definitive trace of what happened has ever been discovered.
Over the decades, different explanations have been proposed, some based on evidence, others on interpretation, and some purely speculative. But none of them have been able to answer every question. What happened on board the Joyita in the final hours of the voyage? Why was the decision made to abandon the ship? And what became of everyone who was there?
These questions remain unanswered, and perhaps that is exactly what keeps this case alive to this day. A mystery that exists somewhere between what can be explained and what we still do not understand. Stories like this, real, unresolved cases like the MV Joyita, continue to stand as some of the most intriguing maritime mysteries ever recorded. And if you're interested in true stories like this, unsolved cases that still raise questions decades later, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like on the video. It helps bring more real investigations and unexplained mysteries like this one to the archive.